Ladies and gentlemen, I'm George Thorman. I'd like to welcome you to another local history program. Today we're going to spend the next hour discussing the Honorable Thomas Talbot, the most famous settler that Elgin County ever had. And to help me with this program, I have as my guest today John Ker, who lives on the original Talbot property called Malahide Farms. John, I think we'll start right off by saying that Talbot was born on the 19th of July, 1771 at Malahide Castle, and we have a picture of that.
Yes, that's right, George. Here's a picture of Malahide Castle. I took this picture on a recent trip. I think it was about 3 years ago. And it shows the castle as it is today. And it's rather an interesting structure. It goes back to the 13th century, and of course the Talbots were established there by William the Conqueror, and lived at Malahide, as it was called. The little town nearby is called Malahide, and that's where the name Malahide Castle comes from. Malahide actually is a Gaelic word meaning high on a cliff overlooking the sea. So the name given to Malahide is appropriate because it overlooks the Irish Sea, and the owners of Malahide were always known as the admirals of the Irish Sea.
Were they? Now, Talbot was born then into what we call the Anglo-Irish aristocracy, and just what does that mean?
Well, of course, Ireland has always been an important part of British history, sometimes, quite often in fact, a thorn in the flesh of the English crown. It was always used as an invasion route, Ireland from Europe, by various monarchs trying to put other monarchs off the throne, and also by other people like Napoleon wanting to gain a foothold in what you might call the soft underbelly of the British Isles, which is Ireland, because the Irish are basically of Celtic origin, and the invaders who came over with William the Conqueror and the Saxons and the Picts and people like that were people who drove the Celtic people farther and farther out to the fringes of the islands, and so we find them in Ireland and in the north of Scotland at this time. But the Anglo side of it is anyone who has come as a conqueror, as it were, to Ireland, and the Irish side of it is the intermingling between the British conquerors and the Irish people. And so to be Anglo-Irish, one has to have a little bit of both sides showing up in their pedigree.
Now, Talbot was not the oldest son in the family, so he's no chance of him inheriting the property. So what did they decide for a career for him?
Well, for an aristocratic family, such as the family that Colonel Talbot came from, there were really only three choices, and those were the three estates: the church, the law, or the military service. Talbot was the youngest son. No, he was the second youngest son. His elder brother inherited the estates. And Talbot was the second son, and he had another brother, William, and of course they both went into the army. And so Talbot's career began as an ensign in, I think it's the 24th Foot, at the age of 12, which seems a little bit young, but we have lots of Army cadets floating around today, I suppose, who are 12.
But anyway, he went in as an ensign at the age of 12, and then in that fall he was made a lieutenant. And then the regiment was the 66th Foot, I think it was called. Yeah. And then the regiment was disbanded, and he went home and went back to school. And now he was paid as an ensign. Yeah. Then I suppose he went back to school for a few years until 1787, when he was made a lieutenant in the 24th Regiment of Foot and an aide-de-camp to the governor of Ireland.
The Viceroy of Ireland.
Yes, what was his name?
It was the Duke of Buckingham at the time, and interestingly enough, Colonel Talbot had a local chum, who grew up on the next estate to him, and his name was Arthur Wellesley, and they both went to the court of the Viceroy in Dublin. And Arthur Wellesley went off to India and made himself a distinguished soldier, and eventually became the Duke of Wellington. And of course, Talbot, after serving in the army for some time, decided after serving in Canada that he wanted to go to Canada and start settling that country.
Well, I got here, now when he became a aide-de-camp to Buckingham, he was just 16 years old.
Yes.
And Wellesley was an aide-de-camp too, when he was 16. Now in 1790, he's now 19, he comes to Quebec with his regiment, or to join his regiment, and then in 1791 to Montreal, and then in 1791 Simcoe came to Canada as the governor of Upper Canada. Yes. And he hired Talbot as his private secretary.
Yes, well, it was quite a usual thing to put promising young officers as on the staff of someone like it was really a military governor. He was a lieutenant governor. He was the first lieutenant governor of Upper Canada. Right. And of course, he was at Niagara-on-the-Lake. That was the seat of the government at that time. And if anyone goes to Niagara-on-the-Lake, you'll see a picture of Simcoe. Sitting at the first legislature meeting in Upper Canada, and Talbot's on his left-hand side. That's in the old fort at
Niagara-on-the-Lake.
Yes.
Now he was quite a hit with Mrs. Simcoe.
Well, I think yes, Mrs. Simcoe was one of these brave souls who went out with her husband to rough it in the bush. And she was a very talented person herself. She was a good cook, I gather. And probably if you found a good cook, you probably found people like Colonel Talbot sitting around wanting to have some pie.
Yeah, probably.
Yes, I think they got along very well. And of course, Talbot was rather like a son to Mrs. Simcoe.
Now, in 1793, it's still at Newark, and Simcoe decides to take a trip down to Detroit. And from Newark, they make their way overland to what's now Brantford and Burford, and then come to the Thames. And then they take canoes down the Thames. And that was the first trip Talbot had to this territory. Now, that was the trip where Simcoe decided on the site of London.
That's right, yes. He wanted to call it New Georgia on the Thames, or Georgina, yes. He was really thinking about the military implications of it, because it was well back from the lake and from the invasion routes, and it was in a promising agricultural part of the country, and of course the fur trade was still going on, but it was moving farther away, and the second wave of settlement, which was the consolidation of the settlement on the land and the production of food. This was all in the wind at the time. So London, or New Georgia on the Thames, named after King George III, of course, New Georgia was an attractive site to Simcoe and to the government. Yeah, well now, a lot of historians say that this was the trip in which Talbot first saw Port Talbot, which eventually settled, but that's not true, is it? Well, it's hard to say. I'm not just sure what the route was that they took, but undoubtedly they would have to have perhaps gone down the Thames and then back along the lake. And going back along the lake, they would have come to Rondo, and then around Rondo and along the North Shore. And it's quite possible that on their way back, they camped overnight at Port Talbot.
Yeah.
It was on the map at the time because the French explorers had put it there.
Yeah, that would be Gallinet's map. That was made in the 1600s.
1683, I think it was.
Yeah, and that showed Kettle Creek and what's now Talbot Creek. They weren't named.
Well, it was named. It was LaSalle named it after one of his captains, a man by the name of Tonty. And I think
this is Kettle Creek, though, isn't it?
Oh, I thought no. It's on the map. It shows as Riviere Tonty.
What's now Talbot Creek.
I may be incorrect.
Yeah, I'm just wondering about that, and perhaps should have done some research. I thought he came back with Simcoe via the site of London again, and then the next couple years he's in negotiations with the Indians in Ohio.
Yes.
And he might then very well have stopped at what's now Port Talbot and had a look at it.
That's quite possible. Interestingly enough, Talbot was in the Simcoe papers, which are in the Ontario archives. Talbot is mentioned quite frequently as Simcoe's agent to the Indian agents in Upper New York State. And Sir William Johnston's son, Sir John Johnson, succeeded Sir William Johnson. And I think that Sir William Johnson's plan of settlement had quite an influence on Colonel Talbot in deciding that that's what he wanted to do. I think it was those trips to Upper New York State, which Johnston had settled.
Yeah, because Johnson did have quite a settlement there, didn't he? And now we can't spend too long on this earlier part with Talbot because we want to get into his career. But in 1793, they moved back to York, which was now going to be the new capital, and they laid out the plan of York.
Yes.
And then in 1794, he goes back to England to join his regiment, and he serves in Holland. He's supposed to have served in Gibraltar for a time. In 1799, he's again in Holland, and he's the 2IC of the regiment there. And then that's his military career.
Right. Now, George, I just wanted to show you one thing here, if the screen will pick it up. This is a letter written by Colonel Talbot to his boss, who was the Duke of York. And every school child knows about the grand old Duke of York, who had 10,000 men, and he marched them up to the top of the hill, and it's rather like Humpty Dumpty, isn't it? Anyway, the Duke of York was in charge of the military operations that were taking place in Holland. And Colonel Talbot, if one looked into it, you would probably find that he was a chum of the Duke of York. And in writing to him, you can see, this is a good example of his handwriting. You can see the kind of handwriting that he had, which isn't very much different from the kind of handwriting that a lot of people have today. A little bit indecipherable, but a lot of people's handwriting is today. And he speaks in fairly familiar terms to the Duke of York about. He's talking about his proposal to go to Canada or to give up his military career. And so this is really the first inkling that he is going to start up the settlement.
What is the date of that letter?
1799. It's in 1799.
Yeah. Well, then on the 25th.
Just before we go on, I'd just like to show this other thing because it's an interesting curiosity about early writing, and that is, if you could go down on that now. A lot of letters were rather like airmail forms, and people had a lot to say to each other. And so instead of just writing across the page like that, they would write across the page, and then they would turn the page at right angles, and they would write across the page again. So you had a letter that was written this way, and then you had to turn the page and read it this way. The idea was to save postage.
You got 2 pages of writing on one page. They are fairly difficult to read, aren't they, when you're trying to read?
I don't know. I think if you get used to it, you can do it.
All right. Well, then on the 25th of December, 1800, Talbot sold his commission for 5,000 guineas and came to Canada.
Yes, that was a pretty good price, I would think.
Yeah. Now, where did he go for those first couple years he's here? There's a debate about where he was. He came here and he got land somewhere, and he started to...
I think he went to the Niagara Peninsula and he bought land there, or at least he acquired land there, about 1,500 acres. And he lived there for a couple of years, 2 or 3 years, 2 years anyway, and he didn't like it. And I think he went back to England and then got this immigration idea going with Lord Bathurst, who was in charge of the colonial office. He didn't like to deal with the local people in York. He was always at war with them, and they were always trying to put barriers in his way. So he just went back to England and said, there's an area up here, I want to start settling it. Give me the commission to do the settling, give me my military grant, and I'll go off and see what I can do. So that's what he did.
Well, now, what he envisaged here, this had something to do with him being a younger son and no chance of property in Britain. And what he felt, I suppose, was that some kind of land settlement scheme here would give him an opportunity to build up a big estate for himself.
Yes, he was encouraged by Simcoe in this because Simcoe had a great idea that the British aristocracy should establish feudal baronies in Canada, rather along the French system, a seigneurial system. And that was the way Canada, or British North America, was going to stay loyal to Britain and develop along the British lines. Talbot had a great pride in his lineage and his family, and he wanted to make a contribution to that in history. And so that's really there was really nothing else left for him. It was said that he was in love with King George III's daughter, Princess Charlotte, and that when he was turned down in that place because he didn't have enough money, he simply turned his back on the army and wanted to go out to the colonies.
Yeah. That seems also, there's certainly some kind of upset romantically with somebody, but then he also seemed to have turned against the licentiousness of that life of the aristocracy. Would you agree with that?
Well, I think that Regency England, if anyone knows anything about the art and history of Regency England, it was a profligate, if that's the correct word, era. We hadn't gone into the Victorian era, which of course was a reaction to Georgian England. Morals were certainly very loose.
And the king's sons really weren't very good examples, were they?
Well, no, the king's sons had a pretty good time. Yeah. Although the Duke of York was one of them, and he was a fine military figure.
No, he was all right, but I think of Prinny, the oldest son, who pretty disreputable character, wasn't he?
Yes, well, we don't want to get involved in any libel suits here, George.
Well, he's dead, thank goodness. Well, so anyway, Talbot came here, and he really, it didn't that he didn't bring a lot of servants with him. He was capable of really being a pioneer himself, wasn't he?
Yes, I think that that certainly is one quality that seems to stand out in anyone who met him on these expeditions, that he really was a woodsman and loved to go out and chop down trees. And he liked to cook, actually. He did all the cooking in his camp for his men. When he landed at Port Talbot in 1803, I think there were 4 other men with him. And they stayed with him for a few years, and then they got land, and they were off on their own. But yes, he was certainly, he liked the frontier.
Yep.
And he wanted to turn his back on the rather artificial life of the court.
And I suppose that as well as the artificial life, whatever romantic attachment it was, and there are half a dozen different stories of who it might have been, also contributed to it. No, he started in 1803, and he had a grant for 5,000 acres of land, and he was supposed to bring out settlers and give them 50 acres. He was to get 200 acres. Now, by 1808, he's only established 20 settlers.
Mm-hmm.
And,
of course, that was an era of conflict in Europe. The Napoleonic Wars were in full swing. Armies had not been disbanded, and there wasn't really a lot of demand for settlement. It wasn't until after Waterloo, and then, of course, in the 1830s, when the great land hunger hit Ireland and Scotland, and the land clearances were done. When the landlords just literally loaded all the tenants up on boats and sent them out to the New World.
Now, Talbot did have a couple of plans. You have to realize he settled in. Let's show that picture of the lakefront there. Yeah, let's show that. That's what really the lake shore, when Talbot settled in 1803, hasn't really changed very much. This is a modern picture of Malahide Farms.
Yes, it's.
But the lake shore at that time, well, if you look at it now,
can you pick it up?
I know we're having a problem getting this picture on.
Yes, Port Talbot was never developed. I think probably the river was a little bit too small. It's a little smaller than Kettle Creek, and Colonel Talbot himself didn't like to have people around him. He didn't want a lot of people encroaching on him. Yes, this is the lake, and of course the lake was the great highway of the early days of the pioneer era. The pioneer era really corresponds, in this area, corresponds to Colonel Talbot's tenure of this area from 1803 to 1853 when he died, that 50-year period. The lake was the highway. Schooners plowed up and down it, and they dropped people off. They dropped people off at Port Talbot, right on the beach here, right at the mouth of the Talbot Creek. And of course, they had to climb up the hill and wait for Colonel Talbot to interview them and see if he thought they would make good settlers. And if he thought that they would make good settlers, then he would issue a little piece of paper telling them where to go, and then he would ask them to do their settlement duties, which was to clear, I think it was 5 acres of land in the first year and 10 in the second, and to do some work along the roadway, which eventually became the Talbot Road. And if they fulfilled their settlement duties, then they were allowed to pay a patent fee to Colonel Talbot and have that land registered in their name.
Yeah, I think the point I was starting out to make, and we had a hard time getting that picture on, was that Talbot had settled in an area that had no roads at all. And I think he realized that if he was going to attract settlers, he had to have some kind of a road policy. Mm-hmm. And that's when he hired Burwell and laid out the Talbot Road. And then did he not have a scheme that he persuaded the government that all the lots on the Talbot Road should be sold to settlers? In other words, no lots kept for the church, no lots kept for the government.
Yeah, clergy reserves, school reserves and clergy reserves were pushed back.
Yeah. That was fairly important, wasn't it, to his...
Well, I think it certainly was to opening up the country, and of course the Talbot Road was considered the best road in the whole of Upper Canada, and it went from Fort Erie to Detroit. Yeah. And because of Colonel Talbot's settlement policies, it was the land was picked up there rather quickly.
Yeah. Yeah, I've noticed in early land applications, 1809, 1810, 1811, they all say they're applying for a lot of land on the road leading to Port Talbot.
Yeah.
They want to settle there. And then they, at the bottom of that applications, they were probably all written out at Malahide, and they'll have at the bottom recommended by Thomas Talbot.
Something like that.
And then he put their name on a little map he had.
Yes, the maps actually are preserved in the Ontario archives, and we have photostats of them in the Elgin County Pioneer Museum.
And now, some people, do you feel Talbot was fairly fair to the settlers?
I think he wanted a loyal British subject. He wanted to make this a stronghold of British sentiment, largely to counter what he thought, what everyone feared. We rather think about the Americans at the time as being rather like Iranians or wild men that would do almost anything, and republicanism was something new, and of course they weren't very far removed from the American Revolution, so that Talbot thought of the British tradition as very important. And United Empire Loyalists, of course, were welcome, but no one who didn't want to work on his own land and become part of the settlement. In other words, land speculators, which were so common in other parts of the country, were not tolerated by Colonel Talbot in the Talbot settlement.
Yeah, he wasn't anxious to let some capitalist or entrepreneur pick up 500, 600, 700 acres at a settlement price and then sell it to someone else after doing a little work on it. Coyne,
in his book, his preface to the book about the Talbot papers, his collected papers, blames Colonel Talbot for the slow growth rate of the Albury and Dunwich townships in Elgin County because he held back a lot of the land for himself. In other words, he took his compensation for his efforts in land in Dunwich and Albury townships, and actually at the time of his, in 1840, when the wild land tax was imposed on him, I think he had about 70 to 75,000 acres in his own name. And of course, at that time when they put the wild land tax onto it, he had to start getting rid of it. That's probably why they did. So, in a way, he was the worst speculator of the lot, but he wouldn't let anyone else do any speculating. And I think that Coyne has a point, perhaps.
Yeah, Coyne is one of the Talbot has Ermatinger defends him. He's a conservative, and Coyne, both the Coynes attack him a little bit. And of course, they're reformers or liberals. Although I thought Fred Coyne Hamill is very fair to Talbot in Lake Erie Barren.
Yes, well, he, of course, is of Coyne background, but I think he's essentially a modern historian without any axes to grind. He couldn't care less, and he was just concerned with the facts as he saw them. And I think he did a very level, even job on portraying Colonel Talbot for what he actually was.
Well, we have Talbot then. You mentioned that figure of about 77,000 acres that he had. But he was, in theory, got 200 acres for each settler he put on a lot. And he put them on the lots in Yarmouth and Southwold and some in Dunwich, and then he'd take the land in Albury. And now, all of a sudden, I think Talbot must have realized, he was born in 1771, and by the time the colony is going very well, he suddenly realizes, I have no children. Now, what can you tell us about that?
Well, that must have been a difficult one for Talbot. He said that the only woman that I ever loved was the daughter of Sir John Johnson, and she wouldn't have me. I'm not sure whether she was half Indian or what she was. Maybe she was. So he didn't have any family, but he tried to interest his own family in investing in that part of the country, and they were starting to form little trust companies and building societies, as they were called. But he did have a nephew by the name of Airy, Richard Airy, who was married to a niece of Colonel Talbot's, and as a matter of fact, Richard Airy's mother was Colonel Talbot's sister. I'll show you a picture of her. She's rather a pretty lady. This picture is curled a bit, but I'll just hold it in there for you. You can see she's there she is. She looks a little bit like Queen Victoria there, but she's...
Yeah, she's a beautiful woman.
Yes, she's a lovely girl. And when I visited the descendants of the Airy family, they had her out over the mantelpiece, and Mrs. Airy's wife was down in the basement because she was the ugly one. Anyway, this girl is Catherine, her name is.
And this is the sister of Talbot and the mother of Julius and Richard Airy.
Yes, that's right. And Airy married his first cousin, so there's a lot of inbreeding there. And Airy could really have been called a Talbot. Almost. But anyway, yes, Airy was in Canada and went through more or less the same routine that Colonel Talbot had gone through. He served on the staff of the Governor General, who was Lord Aylmer in Quebec in 1830 to 1832, and he visited Port Talbot at that time. He was a keen woodsman and a very keen horseman, and liked the outdoor life. He was a physically very, very active man, Airy. It must have been in the family, because I think Talbot was the same way. And he visited Colonel Talbot in 1832, and I suppose they must have had discussions then. And then I think he visited him again in 1838 and brought his younger brother Julius Airy out. For Colonel Talbot to look over and see whether he thought he might be a good person for Talbot to settle his inheritance on, because Airy was really quite keen on his army career, and he was doing very well. But Julius Airy was a city boy, and he didn't like the frontier. He liked the balls and bells. And eventually he went back to Ireland and became a very successful lawyer. Then Airy, Richard...
Just interrupt there. In Julius, really the only good time he had when he was here was when the Harris girls from London came over to pay a visit to Malahide, or he went over to London to see them. And then when the rebellion was on, he served in the cavalry and one of the regiments down in Windsor.
Yes,
in
I think there's mention of him serving with the local cavalry, which went from St. Thomas to the frontier.
Yes, and they were on duty for 2 years.
Yes, at Fort Malden.
Well, they were at Fort Malden, and then they were at London when the trials were on of the people who were tried, you know, Joshua Doane and those people. Yeah. I think they were on duty from January 1840 to or 1838 and 39 until about May 1840, really over a 2-year period. That now they changed a lot, and but James Ermatinger was the captain of that troop for all that time, and all the pay sheets show him there.
Is he the son of Edward Ermatinger?
No, he's a nephew of Edward Ermatinger.
I see.
He was a son of another.
Ermatinger, of course, was the Hudson's Bay factor who came to retire in the Talbot settlement. Was that not so?
Well, he came really to make his fortune here too, the same as Talbot did. Well, Julius Airy, let's get back to Talbot, or we're getting another fascinating character of the family, the Ermatingers. Julius couldn't stand it, and he went back to Ireland. So that was the first effort of Talbot to find an heir.
Right.
And then I've got here in 1846, he wrote to Richard Airy.
Yes. Well, Airy, who was in charge of the western frontier during the Mackenzie Rebellion, he was the colonel of the 38th Regiment, or is it the 34th? And served at Fort Malden. And then when that particular incident was cleaned up, he was ordered back to Toronto, and he stayed in Toronto, and he was in charge of the troops in Toronto in some skirmishes that they had there.
John, did he not serve a couple months in St. Thomas? His regiment?
Well, I think his regiment was based in St. Thomas and went out to the frontier from St. Thomas, rather than London. The cavalry was probably developed from St. Thomas because of Airy's interest in cavalry, which is borne out in the Charge of the Light Brigade. We'll come to that soon enough.
Well, all right, then Talbot wrote to him in 1846. Now, what was the proposition he made?
Well, that's we haven't got that a particular piece of correspondence, but Airy interpreted it as an invitation to come to Port Talbot and be his heir. And Airy at the time was in the Mediterranean, and on the island of Corfu, on the staff of the military governor of Corfu, and he thought about this for a while, and eventually was posted back to England as Assistant Quartermaster General under Lord Wellington, the Duke of Wellington, Talbot's friend. The Talbot, the Duke of Wellington said to Airy, "You better go out and see what you can do, but if things don't work out, come on back and we'll give you a job again." So in 1848, Airy, on his word, at the invitation of Colonel Talbot, went out to inherit Colonel Talbot's lands, and he established himself at Port Talbot.
Yep. I understand that first he lived in Burwell's old home on Burwell's Corners.
Yes.
I've got him in 1847. Burwell had died the year before, and then in 1848 he moved into Talbot's house. Now, I suppose you invite me to be your heir, and I say, well, okay, and I move out to Malahide, and I suppose I figure I should have some responsibility and take things over. Eh?
Well, yes, and he certainly did take things over, and Talbot, of course, was pretty old by this time. He was 79 or 80, and he had really pretty well lost control of the settlement because everything had been turned over to the government in York, and all he was really left with was his own personal holdings, and his dealings with various people and the sale of his lands was really what Airy became involved in, and there was a bit of a mess in his accounts, as it were, and Airy had to straighten all that out. And of course, Colonel Talbot, in his latter life, living out at Port Talbot in a lonely, isolated situation, became rather a heavy drinker, and Airy found this difficult to deal with, and Mrs. Airy found it difficult to deal with, and Talbot wouldn't let the Airy family change things, and Airy wanted to make things more civilized, and of course he had a family. So really he stayed there for a while, but he didn't get along with Talbot, and he eventually had to make an agreement to go back to England.
Well, they did have a quarrel, didn't
Yes.
they? And then Talbot did turn over. You got something about?
Well, there's a sketch where Airy in 1848, Talbot went to England, and Airy stayed on at Port Talbot and started rebuilding Malahide Castle, or Malahide House. And this is a sketch that I picked up of Airy's in Herefordshire. Actually, it shows his idea, his little design for the rebuilding of Malahide, with a new addition on the east end of the house. So that's I don't know whether that turns out very well. Airy was quite a notable artist, and there's a recent show at the Regional Art Gallery in London with quite a lot of his stuff. Here's another picture which is current to that age, and this will be hard to pick out, but it shows Colonel Talbot in his den at Malahide, sitting in front of a table, and there's a chair in the foreground, which is exactly like one that we received to the Elgin County Pioneer Museum from the University of Western Ontario, about 20 years ago. And these are supposedly the maps that he kept his records on. And this is quite a famous a picture of Colonel Talbot. There's a copy of it up in Eldon House. I got this in Herefordshire. This is of the original, which is in Herefordshire.
So Airy was really quite a fair artist, as many British officers were, because they were trained to make drawings, weren't they?
Yes.
For military purposes. Well, then they had the big argument, and I suppose Mrs. Airy's daughter died too, didn't she, at Talbot?
That's
Fort
right.
Talbot,
She was pretty unhappy there all around, because it was way out in the middle of nowhere.
So Airy goes back. First, Talbot gave him the estate.
Should I show you what Airy looks like?
Yes, we should have a picture.
Are we going to get
of him.
on with that?
No,
later
we better have a picture of Richard Airy. Yeah.
Well, this isn't a picture of him as a young man. This is a picture of him later on in his Army career when he's a brigadier general. And his chest is covered with all the medals of all the countries in the world.
Well,
the Crimean War medals here, the four clasps, 2 and 2.
Well, so Talbot then quarreled with Airy, but he gave him half of the property.
Yes.
Airy went back to England, and then Airy from there resumed his military career, and he went out to the Crimea.
Right, yes, that's right. And yes, he went out to the Crimea in charge of a division. It was a Balkans campaign, and then it developed into this expedition to the Crimea to strip the huge naval establishment that the Russians had built at Sevastopol. And so when he got out there, the Quartermaster General of the British Expeditionary Force, his name was de Ross, General de Ross, who is noted as being the first bather with just a pair of shorts on. Anyway, Lord de Ross went home to England, and Airy took over from him, and became involved in the administration of that expeditionary force, and had the distinction of writing out the order for the charge of the Light Brigade.
Of which he got a great deal of criticism, although he had nothing to do with the charge of the Light Brigade.
Yes.
But he wrote out the orders from dictation of Lord Raglan, I guess it was, eh?
Yes, that's right.
And Lord Cardigan misinterpreted the orders and ordered them to charge up the valley right into the Russian cannon. You want to talk about that for?
Well, there's a very well-written history of it called "The Reason Why" by a British authoress by the name of Cecil Woodham Smith, and she really went into it in a lot of detail. In actual fact, there were 3 orders given for the charge of the Light Brigade. First was a preparatory order asking the Light Brigade to move into a certain position to recapture some guns that were on a height. The second order told them to go ahead and try and capture the guns and bring them back. And the third order was in exasperation because nothing had happened after the issue of the first order, the second order, and it simply said, charge the guns and get them. And of course, the fellow that took the order down from Raglan, who was way up high on a cliff, and who could see what was going on, the chap who took the order down had some rather fancy notions about what cavalry could do and should do, and he gave the commander of the Light Brigade, Lord Cardigan, the wrong direction to go in, and of course they went charging.
In other words, what they wanted Cardigan was go up the hill and protect the British guns, that had just been captured by the Russians, and he went right down the valley, right into the mouth of the Russian guns.
Yes, yes. Actually, the casualties from that charge weren't as heavy as they were acceptable.
Yeah. But it really goes down as one of the, a Frenchman who was watching it, he said, c'est magnifique. In other words, it's magnificent, but it isn't war. Well, anyway, Airy got tremendous criticism for this, although he had nothing to do. So eventually he got back to Britain.
That's right. He eventually went back to England, and he was the governor of Gibraltar, and ended up as a full general in the British Army, and had a very distinguished Army career.
And of course, he sold off through Beecher, a London lawyer who was his agent, all the property he owned in Elgin County.
That's right. Mrs.
Now, John,
Beecher
I think
the Beecher house is still in London.
Yeah.
It's on Rideout Street,
Is
I
it?
think it is. Yeah.
So he sold it first. You know who he sold it first to?
Well, Airy inherited the Port Talbot estate property, which was approximately 1,500 acres at the time. And of course, the interesting differences between Airy and Colonel Talbot's manservant, a companion, George Macbeth is sort of a dramatic chapter in the final dissolution of this property. But Airy actually received the property and held it until 1869, and it was sold at that time to the Macbeth family, and the Macbeth family owned it until 1925 when it was bought by some Americans.
See, this George Macbeth you married became the sort of general factotum to Talbot, and Talbot left him all the property he had left.
That's right. About half of his inheritance went to the Macbeth.
And then Talbot died in 1853 at the age of 82, and Macbeth inherited it. Then he must have sold land to raise the money to buy the Talbot estate in 1869. Eh?
I would think so, yeah.
So the Macbeths did all right out of that.
Yeah, they did. You know, there's a lot of talk about George Macbeth sort of cozying up to Colonel Talbot, but I don't know. It's an easy thing to say about someone, but I think Macbeth really did look after poor old Colonel Talbot in his old age, and I don't think Airy was terribly interested in looking after him.
No. I think Airy was pretty disgruntled all his life about that. Well, then, what I want to get to is that the Talbot estate then is in private hands in 1869 and remained in private hands until your family came to the scene. I'd like to talk a little bit about the history of the Talbot estate the way it is now.
Yes.
Now, when did your family...
Well, we bought it in 1954. My father was retiring from the newspaper business at the time, and I had just come back from service in the Navy in Korea and decided that I wanted to do something else. And this property was on the market, and we had always lived in the country, and he was anxious to get out in the country, and so was I, because I'd been living in very confined quarters for 10 years. And so we decided that we would take a crack at Port Talbot. And so we came up here. I came up here on the 13th of June, 1954, and started things rolling at that time. It had been owned by a group of Americans before that, known as the Seniors Corporation of Detroit, Michigan, or Wayne County, Michigan. And they had bought it at the time of Prohibition and wanted to turn it into a country club, rather along the line of the Seigneury Club at Montebello. And they sold shares in it, and people, even in 1954, kept rolling up and showing me shares of this company that they thought they owned the land. I said, no, I'm sorry, you don't own the land. But we bought it in 1954 and started to work on fixing up the farm, fixing up the house, and getting the property into proper shape for farming and for living. And that's about what has happened to it since our tenure began.
Well, then, when did your father die?
He died in 1977, and he lived in Colonel Talbot's house. I lived there for a short time before I was married, and then I moved into another house and fixed it up. But he lived there for the last, I would think 10 years of his life. That was his permanent residence. And when he died in 1977, the house fell vacant, and it was used by other members of the family for some time as a summer house, but it's never really been put to proper use since that time as a residence.
Well, John, it's our most historic house, really, in the county, and your family has been, and you especially, have been really very, very generous about letting tours of high school kids go out there and interested groups go out there. And what do you see as a solution to the problem of the house? I mean, as it is now, you're a private taxpayer. You have to pay all the expenses of upkeep and everything else, and people expect you to see it.
Yeah. Well, it's a difficult question because, of course, we enjoy the ownership of the property, but the expenses involved in keeping that particular house going are rather high. And I have suggested to the rest of my family, and they're very widely spread now. I have 2 sisters and a brother, and they live a long way away from here, and they're not too interested in the place. So there has been the suggestion that it should be sold or turned over to a conservation authority or otherwise disposed of. And this summer we did have, we set the house up rather as a museum, or not as a museum, but as a heritage house, and with all the various items of furniture in it, which went back to Colonel Talbot's day. A lot of the stuff, a lot of the furniture in the house is our own furniture, but it fitted pretty well because it's a lot of early Canadian furniture and paintings and that sort of thing. So we had a 2-week period in August when we allowed the public to come in. They were charged $2.50 a head to cover the costs of it. No one seemed to mind paying that, and it was certainly in a good cause because we were able to fix up the house from the proceeds, or at least do part of that, at least contributed to fixing it up. And if the house could be established on some kind of footing like that, we would gradually withdraw from it and have whatever heritage group or conservation group that we might find responsible to take it over and to take over the land. That's what I would like to see happen. Whether it'll happen that way, I don't know. A private investor may come along and decide that he or she wants to.
Well, if a private investor does come along, I understand you do have a price on it.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and if a private investor comes along and buys it, then.
Yes, well, we haven't. We have discussed it with the provincial government, and the provincial government has not made any indication that it can do anything about it. It would have to be done through some sort of a trust or a conservation authority. It's too bad that we don't have what they have in England, the National Trust, which is a well-found trust organization drawing its funds from many sources and restoring and keeping in being these marvelous old houses in England that are part of the heritage of that country, and to a large measure have been instrumental in saving Britain a lot of foreign exchange by attracting tourists to the country. So that is really probably the way a place like that should go.
Yeah, we're a funny country. We have no setup for that. We like people to be able to go to historic places as long as somebody else is paying for it. And we really have no provision for looking after things. This is what's happened to the estate from the time that it was turned over to Harry, and Harry sold it to the Macbeths, and so on. You know. Maybe we should just look at a few pictures of the house as it is now.
All right.
And
there's a...
We only have a few minutes, John.
Oh,
I think
right.
we're going to have to...
Right. Well, here's a picture of the house taken in the spring of this year, and it shows it as it is today. There's some nice tulips out in front, and it's an early time of the year. A little crooked.
Well, that's all right. That is really much the same as Harry designed it, isn't it?
It's the feeling is the same. It hasn't come out quite the same way. The entrance is new. I think Fred Green designed the entrance.
Oh, yeah.
So, and it fits into rather the pattern of the Elgin County Pioneer Museum and that sort of thing. And it really it makes the house quite attractive. It looks from the outside to be quite small, but in fact, when you get inside, it's a very large house. The ceilings, the ceilings are 14 feet high, and The living room, I think, measures 20 by 26, and has been described as a perfectly proportioned Georgian room. The house might be called Greek Revival or neoclassical, or with a Georgian flavor to it, a colonial Georgian flavor. This is the living room, and the entrance hall is has a stairway leading up into the attic, and has various pictures in it, and maps and other documents. So the tour that we had went through all the rooms and explained the rooms as the tour group went through, and I think people generally found it quite a worthwhile experience. What I really would hate to see done is to have the thing commercialized with popcorn and that sort of thing. It should really remain simple, and that serene atmosphere, and you can go out to the cliffs and see over Lake Erie, and it's a soul restorer.
Yeah, I know it's a beautiful place, and you have been having some tours of high school students that you set up this fall.
Yes, we've had students out, and the program, the local history program in the public schools in grade 8 fits into this, and it certainly, I think, gives the students a feel for what they're reading in the books. And they'll remember that.
Well, I know a great number of Elgin County students and Elgin County residents have been through this historic house, but it's really because of the generosity of Mr. John Ker, who has always been interested in making the house available. And I hope, John, that you don't sell the property. I do hope that something will turn up by which the historical part of that, the house, can be preserved. And I'd like to thank you very much for coming today and talking to us about the very interesting history of the Talbot settlement and the Malahide farm. And thank you very much for listening.